Okay, salam alaikum. This is video 3. Okay, now, so, as we said, humanity, the consciousness is going to change dramatically. Okay? It's going to change dramatically. And as we said before, too, because, the female has been repressed, for thousands of years. The female consciousness has been repressed for thousands of years. So it's almost like it's difficult to know what the female consciousness was to be naturally, right? Now, also in 1958, Pluto was in the constellation of Virgo, right? And so generally when Pluto is in any constellation, that constellation is going to go through a transformation. And Virgo representing, generally it represents the female, right? It's looked to represent a female, right? The female aspect of, the 12 signs, right? So, so Virgo being in that sign, it demonstrates that the woman was going to go through a change too, right? But, consequently, the Virgin to represent that sign was male, Michael, right? So that demonstrates that the woman was going to go through a change whereby she was going to become more stronger. Let's say she was going to become stronger. She was going to go through a change, right? A celestial change, right? And so a conscious change, right? So and religion was going to go through change, right? Spirituality was going to go through a transformation, right? And that can be seen today as well with with Uranus in the house, as we said, Uranus in the house of Aries, and waking up the humanity getting a wake-up call, right? And in the 60s or the 50s, Uranus was in the heart, while Pluto was in, Virgo. So the consciousness of, the consciousness at that time was the civil rights movement, of course. And so that consciousness is coming to fruition, as well as the consciousness whereby the woman's consciousness would change as well is coming to fruition at the same time. So prior, to, let's say around 1950, in the 1950s, women started to speak out against the so-called gender roles, right? Whereby her only duty in life was to support, man, support him in his endeavors, his dreams, his job. Her only duty was to support and please others, to accommodate, a role of servitude, because Virgo is supposed to be the house of service, right? The constellation of service, right? To serve others, right? So that was generally attributed to women, right? To serve the man, right? So, and to please him, and pleasing him was the only objective in life, and pleasing him validated her as a woman, as a female. Her identity was to be achieved through a man, through her husband. Even taking her husband's last name was to be how she was to be identified. Serving her children, taking care of her children is one thing, but to have to basically be her only divinity was seen as a mother, right? So, and that came, to be a mother is to serve. So a woman's, priority at that time, prior to the civil rights movement, was a service position, So now that is changing as well. A woman is to have her own identity, her own, her own happiness is important, as well as her children and her husband and all those who she has any type of relationship with, she socializes with. She keeps her own name. In the past, it was, if her husband was a doctor, that was the only recognition she had was, that's Dr. So-and-so's wife. Or that's her husband is a lawyer. Or her husband, and even to marry well was for a woman to marry well she was to marry well because she was to get her identity through her husband, right? So now that is even changing as well, right? No longer is a woman to be validated by her husband, by her service that she provides to her husband, to be the old saying, a woman's job is to stand by her man, right? Now, it's one thing to stand by your, support your husband, in his hopes and his dreams, his aspirations, but her aspirations must be supported as well. Whereas before, her aspirations, she wasn't to be expected to have any aspirations, right? She had no aspirations that warranted recognition, and the only recognition she could receive was by being validated by her husband, and that was she was a good wife if she served him well, right? So that is the representation of the house of, let's say, the constellation, or the expectation of or I won't say that, the character, the spiritual identity of Virgo has changed, okay, of what it is to be a woman, right? Okay, because Virgo represented the woman, right? The piety of the woman, right? The character of the woman, the spiritual nature of a woman. And the spiritual nature of a woman in the past was just to serve and be validated through her service by a man. If her husband said she was good, then that was, that meant she was good. That was the validation that she received. That was, let's say, the only validation she received is the validation from her husband. And not only that, but if her husband didn't approve of her behavior, right, then that was to cause her to spiral into depression and misery and and total unhappiness, because her only duty in life was to please her husband, okay? And she was to be humbled and obedient, right? Like a servant, right? And that opened the door for abuse and oppression of women. Okay, so that is what women are fighting for today. They are fighting for their own nature to be recognized as individuals, to be recognized as women, not to be whereby they have to be validated by some male standard of what a woman should be or a woman's position should be. Okay, they no longer want to be characterized by a male agenda for the woman's nature, how a woman's nature should be characterized, and her role in society should be characterized, because that, as I said, that is what led to abuse and oppression. Even their intellect was not even recognized. And many times it isn't today. It was a woman can't think because she's got emotions. In third world countries, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is not a country, it's a kingdom. Women have no rights that need to be observed. They can't even, drive by themselves. It's insane. So the nature of the Virgo is changing. The celestial. I mean, no, not the celestial nature, but the characterization, the spiritual characterization of what Virgo was to represent as it related to a woman is changing. Okay, that's coming into fruition as well as it relates to the civil rights movement in the 60s, and Pluto being in that position, that celestial position at that time, which also represents, it's also to represent an aspect that is to be recognized as part of the change in consciousness, today. So, and as I said, that is why the Pluto in Virgo generation represents a spiritual change in the dynamics of the manner in which humanity is to perceive spirituality and the gender roles, because the gender roles for females had to be generally, as I said, validated by men, or a woman's role in society was to be conditioned or dictated by a male hierarchy, and a woman had no identity at all. The Vatican, male society, was the apparatus that determined what a female's role was in society, what she could do, what she could not do, or what was expected of her to do, what qualified her as a good woman, or what qualified her as a bitch. Okay, and generally opening her mouth and saying what she did not like, what she would accept and not accept, determined her to be a bitch. If she didn't like abuse, she was a fucking bitch. If she opened her mouth too much, she was a bitch, right? Okay. So that was the apparatus. The Vatican was the apparatus that generally dictated that, because the Vatican controls the commercial world, right? And the man was the head of the household, right? Okay, when in reality, the woman, he may be the head of the family, but the woman is the head of the household. I mean, because if you're going to be fruitful and multiply, right, then whatever you bring to that house, that woman's going to multiply it. So she needs to be the one to divide, whatever the resources in that family is, right? Not the man, right? He brings home the bacon and lets her cook it up and divide it among the family, right? The beef bacon or chicken, turkey bacon, and not pork bacon. Okay. So anyway, so no longer is a woman wanting her identity determined by men, her role. Who knows her nature better than herself. So she's wanting her own nature represented accurately. Okay. So okay. And also under the old, character by which women were identified as, it was that women were placed into subjugation because they had to get their husbands' validation. They had to be validated by their, they had to be validated as good women based upon their husbands, approval of them, their behavior. Right? Whether or not they made their husband happy. And you can't, and most times it was easier to please Allah than it was to please a man, a woman's husband at that, generally. So Pluto and Virgo definitely represents change for the woman, right? And by the appearance of the virgin male, represented by a very gentle man, Michael Joseph Jackson, right? Who was to represent that change, to give birth to to deliver, as it's celestially represented, giving birth to the Liberian girl, or the Libra, right? The Venus, right? Or, yeah, Venus, right? Because Venus represents the Aphrodite, right? Or the Liberian girl. So Michael gave birth consciously to the Liberian girl, the Libra girl, or the Virgo girl, or not the Virgo, or the Venus girl, or the Aphrodite, myself, right? Mashallah Spanatala. Okay, and from giving birth to the Aphrodite, or the Aphrodite, or the Venus, or the, what was that name, Hathor in Egypt, as she was known, right? That consciousness spreads into the world. Be fruitful and multiply. So he passed it on to me, right? That consciousness, by giving birth to me, right? And I delivered into the world, as women are to do, right? As women take on the semen, and then the semen, her body transforms that semen into bodies of man, and see men and see women, right? Okay. So it's the same thing with consciousness, right? So I, alhamdulillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was conceived his consciousness, right? And conceived by his consciousness, right? Mashallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then deliver that consciousness into the world, right? Consciousness of love, right? Because that consciousness, mashallah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saved my life in 2011. So alhamdulillah, that consciousness was delivered to me, subhanallah, and I'm delivering it to the world, right? As I'm to do, right? Okay, and again, nobody in this world is giving you this kind of consciousness, and nobody has ever, other than the prophets, right? Males, okay? There's never been a female, alhamdulillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like me before, and I'm proud to say that, okay? And that may sound a bit arrogant to some, but you know what? Truth, it sometimes can sound arrogant, but you know what? I accept, I accept the truth that is, and I'm speaking the truth that is, and I accept the truth. I said that I accept the truth that is, but more than that, to some it may sound arrogant, and that's just you. That's just your perception and your opinion. You can have it. But it is what it is. Alhamdulillah, it is the truth. You have not received consciousness like this from a woman at all, ever. Okay? Subhanallah. And I'm grateful to be that woman. That beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman. Black woman, too. Aphrodite. Deity, right? Aphrodite. Anyway, Venus, right? Represent Venus, the morning and the evening star, right? Okay. Now, so women and their were placed in servitude roles in society to please men, to please the hierarchy, right? To subjugate the women, so that then the men could be exploited, right? And their resources could be exploited, and the children could be exploited. That by subjugating the women, right? Okay, so now, and that was done historically, and it delegated women to the service of a misogynist, Caucasoid, male, homosexual hierarchy, and in doing so, her foremost duty was to sacrifice, okay, her emotions, aka her passion. Her inherent passion was to be sacrificed to her male counterpart. So her male counterpart was to be given so-called commercial power to be by the misogynist homosexual Vatican hierarchy, the beta male, Caucasoid beta male homosexual hierarchy, okay, was to extend commercial power to the males, right? And and in the form of monetary perks, right? And tell him, and then put him in the position as head of the household, right? Queen of the house, right? Delegating what goes on in the house, and okay, and then subjugating the woman by taking her power and abusing her many times, right? Denying her accesses to resources to even take care of herself. And then the children would have to come to the man for the wealth, thereby he think he has the power, right? And overlook the mother's any influence in the house, right? Therefore take control of the family, break up the family, because the family is structured abnormally, so the family is going to falter. So, and therefore it could cause more confusion in society, right? Because the families are broken up, and higher divorce rates, right? And then what? There goes the prison industrial complex and poor education and all these other things that happen as a result of the breakdown of the family structure, because it's malformed in the first place to subjugate the woman, right? And remove her power and her influence as a female, right? So, and then when she speaks out against it, now she's to be muzzled, because she's not to have any emotion about it. She's just to be numb about it, right? She's to be muzzled, okay? As I said. So, such ill natural, what's that? Such unnatural self-abandonment leaves the female vulnerable to abuse, because it was the role of the woman to please the male, saying no was not an option. She couldn't say no. Even if she was being raped, she couldn't say no, right? Because she had no power of her own, because she had been subjugated to the role, the social gender role of needing validation, and validation came by only way of saying yes. Yes, the man had become her master, right? Yes, she had to become a yes ma'am, right? Because she had no power, or else she wouldn't have been able to what, have a house, or eat, her bills paid, or anything like that, right? She had been delegated to a slave in her own home, right? So, and that's what women are speaking out against today. That's that gender role of subjugation that they have been placed in throughout the millenniums in the West, right? And girls are still subject to that today, and brutality, and experiencing brutality as a result of it, right? So it's because they've been saying, and as I said, they could even be raped, because saying no was not an option. She was never to reject the demands of his desires, of the man's desires. Rejection, it was shut up and go make me a sandwich. Remember that one? Okay. Rejection was to be a cardinal sin. Okay, and punishable. In women, it was punished. Women were to be punished, verbally abused or physically abused by their master, because their only duty was to be obedient. Women who failed to satisfy their male counterpart and reject his affection or his attention, because it wasn't affection, reject his attention, was to be crushed under social condemnation, right? As a bitch, right? Or her fragile emotions were to be crushed, right? Her fragile emotions was to be crushed, because now he didn't want her. Okay, his rejection was to make her feel very, very poor, to disdain herself, because his validation was to mean everything. His validation was to be like a Chinese education, right? If the Chinese don't get an A, they're supposed to commit suicide. That's the stereotype. Well, if a woman don't get her husband's validation, you know, of being perceived as a beautiful, no, as a obedient woman, obedient wife, she was to be you know, basically fall apart emotionally, psychologically, and physically, right? So rejection was she was to be crushed emotionally and even hate herself in the Caucasoid beta male homosexual hierarchy when they condemned her, okay, for that, okay, that provided her identity for as it reflected being a Gentile female, just sweet, so Gentile, so fragile, just a female. Okay, like said, it was Sojourner Truth. Ain't no male ever helped me out of a bit, helped me put his jacket down and help me across a pond or something like that. Help me across a puddle, you know. Ain't I a woman, right? Because the fragile, the white woman was supposed to be so fragile. No, she was supposed to be so damn subjugated. That's what it was, right? And now that many of are speaking out, right? Because they don't want to be identified, their identity to be attached through, you know, their husband, their counterparts' validation of her and what he's to expect of her or approve of her or not, right? Take her apart at will. Okay, so her identity was to be, her having identity was to be frowned upon. A woman wants to drive. Remember back in the day, a woman wants to drive. A woman wants to own property. A woman wants to take her drink. A woman can't raise a man. A woman can't handle this. A woman can't do that. And a woman can't do that. But, you know, without the woman voicing her opinion as to, you know, what she can or what she cannot do. Just totally removing her you know, her influence in her own life. So that, you know, Pluto in Virgo represented that as well. The woman finding her voice, the power in her voice. Okay? Thus, the success of any female was to be dependent upon her husband's approval, or that is what is meant to be a lady. And she was silenced, and silence was golden. She was not to speak to anybody about any type of discontent. Okay, that was frowned upon as well. She was to follow the golden rule and do what you are told, bitch. Okay, dog, or she was a slut, or a whore, or a pig, or she was ugly, or she was fat, or she was a porker, or she was a dummy, or she was you know, crazy, or she was ungodly, or she was a prostitute, or she was, you know, anything but a woman. She was, you know, if she did not approve her husband, she could be degraded by, you know, any malicious comment. Okay, her emotions, she was abused emotionally, she was abused psychologically, and many times physically. She was totally denigrated. Despite all this, the female was to continue, and while going through this, the female was to continue and love the abuser, and she was to serve him without any type of remorse. Serve him, not remorse, but any type of anger, okay, or any type of sentiment about it, about how she was subjugated. She was to be too incompetent to have money, to be able to know how to utilize money, okay. And as I said, even raise her own children. And she was to remain devoted to the abuser, to her mastermind. And she was to be humble as well. You know, she was to be, and weakness was a sign of strength for a woman. She was, as I said, she was to be fragile. and she was to appear her beauty. She was not to. Her beauty was to be hidden. Okay, she was to conceal her beauty. She was not to appear desirable, as it was to represent a female, a female harlot. Okay, she was not, and that was to represent a good woman. That's what it meant to be a good woman, and why many times a black woman. Okay, because she totally went against that grain, was masculine. Anything other than that was masculine. If she voiced her opinion, she showed her emotions. If she showed her intellect, she was masculine. She showed her strength in any way, she was masculine. If she wanted her identity, it was masculine. Anything opposite of what, anything other than subjugation, being placed in a position of subjugation, was to appear masculine. Okay, that was to be masculine. Okay, if she did anything to appear anything other than subjugate or take her identity to be validated by her husband, then she was to be seen as a masculine. Okay, so the role of a woman was to be changed. The role of a wife was to be changed. Pluto in Virgo, the Pluto and Virgo generation of humanity was to change this false narrative for and about females. It was the what was that? It was the burst. Oh, it was the burst. It was the burst, the casket the woman had been buried in. Okay, this new narrative that the women are experiencing today is to burst the casket that the women had been buried alive in for millenniums in the West. Okay, because this is not Eastern as it relates to the African culture. No, women are not. Now, women have in Africa. They have adopted this Western culture perspective of women being basically idiots, weak, vulnerable, subjugated idiots. But in light of a male hierarchy. But in the past, women generally held very powerful roles in the family. It was a matriarch. In the West, it was generally a patriarch. Okay, so the casket is being busted. The casket that women's consciousness has been buried in has been busted, right? With the Pluto and Virgo generation that is now coming into its maturity, right? With the Uranus and that has awakened in the Aries light, the consciousness, the civil rights consciousness that was in the heart of the Judah, heart of the lion in the 60s or the 50s is now coming of age in the. We're going to go to video through. Assalamu alaikum.